Where we finally start Dark Souls 3, my favorite of the series, which is probably heresy to many of you, but I'm actually most excited to talk about Dark Souls 2 and least excited to play it. We will be starting a new character. Right into the schema, we are going to use Kaitha.
Yes, indeed.
I should stop talking.
It is called Lothric, where the transitory lands of the Lords of Cinder converge. In venturing north, the pilgrims discover the truth of the old words. The fire fades, and the lords go without thrones. When the link of fire is threatened, the bell tolls, unearthing the old lords of Cinder from their graves. Aldrich, saint of the deep, Farron's undead legion, the Abyss Watchers. And the reclusive lord of the profaned capital. Yon the Giant. Only in truth, the lords will abandon their thrones. And the unkindled will rise. Nameless, accursed undead, unfit even to be cinder. And so it is that ash seeketh embers.
Okay, we have the opening cutscene. The big thing I want to take from that is that we see 3 lords mentioned, and we have 5 lords in the game that we actually have to go through. The lack of mentioning those other 2 lords comes across as a big discrepancy, kind of an interesting one, as though the other lords are from different lands, and the 2 may both be from Lothric. We'll examine that probably at a greater detail later. Like I said, I was going to go with Kaitha, Goddess of Tears. She first made her appearance in Dark Souls 2, but she has her most prominent appearance here. She felt most appropriate for Dark Souls 3. Dark Souls 3 is, in my mind, a very mournful game. And we're going to do something a little bizarre. Rather than make our goddess a faith user, or a straight miracle user, we're going to go Pyro, another type of build that I don't like to use, but we will mix things up. I do not particularly care about the start. I think, though, that We will go with this just to speed up something later on. Not going to spend a ton of time building the character, but to really make things a little weird. We have to add a couple details. I am going to pick a hairstyle. No. Going for that Firekeeper white. And the other thing we need is... Where is it? Oh, there we go. Because Kaitha is the goddess of tears, she is associated with the 2 tear stone rings, so we will have a bit of heterochromia going on. I want the hair to be, a little different. Not that any of this really matters. LOL, nothing matters. There we go. So Kaitha is in Dark Souls 2 associated with hexes, if I believe, if I remember correctly. It's not, someone will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but hexes, if I recall also correctly, are miracles that use both faith and intelligence, and in this game, pyromancy inherently uses both faith and intelligence, so thematically we're going to go with that. One thing to point out is that Dark Souls 3 begins with a bell tolling, whereas in Dark Souls 1, you are the one tolling the bells. That is your initial task. This makes the bells sort of have they serve a different purpose in these games, and therefore the symbolism is not as direct as we'd like it to be. Or maybe as indirect as we prefer it to be if you have an adventurous mind. We get to the Cemetery of Ash, and there is one very particular thing about this I want to point out. It'll take a little bit to get there. I believe these are grave wardens, which suggests that they are responsible for tending the corpses in this area. They are also somehow clerical, given that they drop sacred chimes, presumably. I mean, this game can always be misleading, but we're led to believe they're related to some sort of religious order. Now, here's the first thing that stands out. This section here very particularly wants you to notice that there is water. There is a depth to it that slows you down, and it's a little annoying, but it draws your attention to the fact that these areas have water. And very conspicuously. We have Crystal Lizard. Hopefully this goes fairly well. Shouldn't be hard, but you never know. playing it a little safe and then also screwing up. This is the worst Crystal Lizard, the worst Crystal Lizard run I have had ever, which is of course the one that I record, but that's how it goes. I generally, when I run Pyro, and I've done multiple Pyro runs that start and then end a couple areas in, I generally find that the Pyro magic doesn't work so well on it. It's just not especially damage intensive, but well, it's very on brand to run a Pyro run and never use Pyromancy, let me tell you. Please. No, we're not dealing with you right now. Almost feel like I should drink, but needs to die. Normally this is not important. This really isn't important, but it's kind of a matter of pride. I do not like the hand axe. Oh my. Dodging into the tail like that is unfortunate. Watch me clumsily fail to use magic. And try to use blood vials. Accidentally kick. That was a comedy of errors. We don't really get too much that's important right now, but I guess, like I said, it's a matter of pride. So, we have here an area that kind of looks damp. The ground here is particularly muddy. And then it's almost as if water flowed through. Like we have perhaps temporary river. The water obviously is mostly gone now, but has collected in this pool because the pool has a lower elevation. This suggests that water went through this area at one point and has collected in the parts that are most the most deeply elevated. And I don't think this is by chance. I don't think this is just like, this is a cool cool area design, we're just going to run with it. I'm inclined not to believe that. One thing that has always, that when I first thought about this really stood out, is that presumably this is the area where the water first came through. What we have above us is, as far as I can tell, supposed to be Lothric Castle. You can even see, if you back off, a sort of archway, as though perhaps an area that ships would sail through. And this entire section reminds me a lot of something that I do not have prepped. There's the arch, nice and visible up there. Almost as if it were a canal underneath the castle for, like I said, bridges for ships to go through. But then the castle got pushed up and the water got removed. It reminds me a lot of the setup used in Dark Souls 1 for the new Londo rooms. In that game, to get to the boss of the area and progress to the end of the game, you have to flush a city, and what ends up happening is that corpses get flushed out of the city and into the Valley of the Drakes, and you have this image of the bottom of the city having just corpse piles that were submerged in the water. So the ash could be thought of in this sense, if we're trying to extend this metaphor, as the flushing of what wasn't good enough to make it into Lothric, being tended by the grave tenders for some particular purpose. We also, interestingly, have a tiny bell up here where, if I remember correctly, we have a much larger bell in the upcoming area. Sometimes my interpretations might seem a little weird, but I almost have... So I think sometimes what we see in areas is not a geographical progression, but a chronological progression. And it's sort of possible that what we have in this area is what originally was the graves that eventually got tended, and that will eventually become the bell tower that we see up there. There's a lot of fuckery going on in terms of relative size, but that is something that I think this series likes to play with, while never drawing attention to it. You might, in one case particularly, remember that on Orlando very deliberately plays with the use of walking on huge structures as though you're a tiny insect infiltrating a giant's castle. You know, I have magic. I will use magic. Oh dear. Caster builds. Oh, hand axes. I am tormenting myself. We have a firebomb. Nothing too interesting to talk about that, but it is kind of fascinating that we have a very conspicuous blood stain. Not anything I can tell you about, but it's one of those details that I try to keep in my mind in case I see something later that somehow recalls it. There's always an inclusion of these, like, tiny, tiny details that really stand out that I do not think, in most cases, are incidental. I tried to dodge, I tried to Bloodborne roll, which... Switching between these games, as I've mentioned, has... You learn muscle memory for one game, and you try to invoke it in the next, and it doesn't work. It comes up in areas much more traumatic than this one. Incidentally, I think the jumping system in this game is better than the Bloodborne one. Having it on the L3 button it's a lot harder to accidentally jump, whereas in Bloodborne, switching from a dodge or a run to a dodge would often get you a jump, which would then leave you vulnerable and cause you to take bonus damage in terms of being a vulnerable target. And that was always frustrating. I like in this that I can, go from a run to a dodge very, very quickly. I think in my opinion, that's a big improvement. Kind of interesting that this looks so much like a particular peak. Again, nothing. I'm an observation for myself more so than anything else. Having restored our stuff, we will go ahead and zoom to the... Like, that enemy is just to teach you about falling attacks. I don't think it has a particularly interesting. And we get here. I think I'll talk about the area post-boss battle, because, okay, actually having thought about it, there's one thing I want to make, to bring your attention before the boss battle. It's almost as though this boss is in the center of a really sad lake, and you also pull a sword out of the boss, as you can see here, in order to initiate the fight. I feel like both of these are deliberate invocations of Arthurian myth. In fact, two different stories merged into one. First you have how Arthur got his sword, at least one of them. One of them is the Lady of the Lake, and this is Our Lady, as it were. The other is pulling the sword out of the stone, and so you get both invoked in the same case. We also have it's very interesting medallion setup. They mention in Dark Souls 1 a lot of times wanting to have medallions on a character as a track of how many kills that character has gotten. I don't have the quotes ahead of me, but it could be that they're pulling back on that motif. The other thing I want to mention for those of you with more experience in these games is that something about this particular mask, it reminds me of Looking Glass Knight, who we'll see much, much later. With all that said, let us start the fight. You can damage it as it's getting up, get some free hits. That shoulder really screws up with my dodging sometimes, but... Ideally, you want to try to rotate around him. He has big sweeps, but he has dead zones on the sweeps. Oh, why am I even doing this? I should not be trying to use magic. I hate using magic. And just play the fight straight. Come on. The other thing to keep in mind with this boss, they always intentionally... I shouldn't say always, but they very often intentionally include a weakness in the boss's moveset. Sort of like a thematic thing that gives the boss more character, a fatal flaw. They first mentioned this in, well, maybe not first, but one of the big mentions is in Dark Souls 2. The Design Works interview, they talk about how the Iron Golem has a very deliberate flaw in the hole in the chest of its center that gives that boss character. But there's also mechanical ones. I think Gwyn was intentionally designed, to a certain extent, to be very parryable, that they wanted to have a very different place, but then thematically that is what worked for them. I really should, because I'm going to want... Recording jitters, hopefully. He does have very distinct tracking dead zones. less than ideal. I didn't want the second dodge there. Get out during the stops, but otherwise be in. Get the knockdown and get the kill. I think he's actually a very good tutorial boss. He teaches you the usual thing that they try to teach you in these later games, that aggression is very, very much favored over passivity. There is a funny quote about that that you'll come to later on. So this area, we have the coffin from the very start, and we have a tree coming out of the coffin. There is, in these games, a lot of times the idea of vegetation growing out of death, that corpses are what nourish the future life. I do not know what type of tree this is, although I had an interesting discussion with someone about how it could be a reference to what happens after Ragnarok, where the two humans are named tree names. I don't know enough to actually tell that particular, do that one justice. We have our first invocation of the wax. The wax is curious. I still don't have a good explanation for it, but it does remind me often of the summoning signs, particularly from Dark Souls 1. That could be entirely incidental. The other thing I want to mention is that I always find it, as soon as I noticed it, it is extremely curious to me that the water here is flowing, despite the fact that it has nowhere to flow to. And that is true for the water that we passed earlier. This could be something that is just the best way that they can make the water look, and, you know, a minor visual detail that only stands out if you pay attention to it. But I kind of almost feel like water is intentionally working here in a supernatural manner, and that it's being drawn towards Lothric. Interestingly, later on, there's another instance of water that is drained away from Lothric. We have the usual door opening motif. It is a animation that they use a lot because it is, you know, it has that epic feel. From that battle, we got Coiled Sword. Sword missing from the shrine bonfire cannot be equipped as a weapon. Thrust into the shrine bonfire to restore its power and enable travel between bonfires. This sword is only bequeathed to chosen Ash, as judged by the Udix, who awaits the arrival of Ash as a scabbard. I am inclined to read the Coiled Sword as sort of a way to tell stories. I think that that motif, that like symbology, is underlined, or it's buried in these games, not ever too overtly mentioned, but there is actually one place where that's not strictly speaking true. Yes. We have more coffins. Homeward Bone. I do not have a lot to say about Homeward Bones. They just take you back to the bonfire without you losing your souls. I do sometimes wonder if there's a deliberate purpose to their positioning. So we have the approach to the Firelink Shrine, and this area reminds me a lot of the reverse that you go through at the beginning of Dark Souls 1. The beginning of Dark Souls 1, you have this mountain that you climb up to get to the Raven, and it is one of the places where coffins are most prominently displayed in Dark Souls 1. This structure kind of invokes that in me. I can't say that that's for sure what they were intending to evoke, but this guy, I think, actually plays a role later on, so we'll just let him live until he is useful to us. I think there is one last thing I want to point out before we go to the shrine. we come over to here and we notice that there's an item. We have some enemies who attack us as soon as we approach the item. If I remember correctly, they are pretty much non-responsive if you go up here or if you walk by without going to the item, as though they were here to protect the item. And it is a shield. I believe it's part of the cleric set. I could be wrong on that. I don't fully remember. But it's another instance, as we saw in the last episode in Dark Souls 1, of these hollows being obsessed with shields. I actually don't have a really good explanation for that, but it's a pattern that I see repeating only during this actual playthrough. Something I didn't really notice in previous runs. I thought there was supposed to be a dog here. Maybe it's on the lower level. There's a dog. What the dog symbolizes, I don't know. It does feel strangely out of place, and that usually means something, I'm fairly certain. So we have Firelink Shrine. We have our usual friend, the typical depressed person.
Roused from the sleep of death. Well, you're not alone.
Hawkwind, if I remember correctly.
Unkindled are worthless. Can't even die right. Gives me conniptions. And they'd have us seek the lords of Cinder and return them to their molten thrones. But we're talking true legends with the metal to link the fire. We're not fit to lick their boots. Don't you think?
He has a peculiar quest line that we will get to later on. We have our good friend Andre in one of the possibly only returning characters in the series that is distinctly identical in both iterations.
I am Andre. I serve at this shrine as a humble smith, forging weapons. You're in search of the Lords of Cinder, I trust. A toilsome journey, I'd wager. You'll require good arms. Let me smith you weapons. I am a smith, such is my purpose.
I'm going to allot to Estes because I'm not going to use a ton of magic, especially early. Other than that, we do not have a lot that we can do at him right now.
I don't want to see my work squandered.
Actually, let's just, for the sake of
Good to see what needs me.
completion.
Weapons and protection are sturdy enough by and large, but when overused, they'll eventually break. When their durability is low, repair becomes a necessity. Use a powder, or simply rest at a bonfire. But should chance impel them break, bring them me. I'll hammer them back into shape. They take no pleasure in breaking, I assure ye. So handle them with care, if you would. But be careful. I don't want to see my work squandered.
He has an assortment of weapons, nothing too noteworthy. The one other thing about this place that I have found very peculiar, I don't have a good explanation for it, is all of the coffins on their side. It is a strange use for coffins to be like that. We have a little bit of water. I'm curious. Does the water continue? It doesn't. We have a dry side and a wet side. No, we do have a little bit of wetness. And that would be an interesting discovery, but it was not to be. Okay, so that's a little preview of a place that we'll be filling with people later on. We also have our friend Ludleth. He is ostensibly the 5th Lord of Cinder, and he's a little tired of being around, not gonna try to escape. he also appears to not really have much in terms of legs, which is a motif that most certainly gets repeated throughout the series, and I'm going to talk more about that when we get to later bosses.
All that unkindled, and a seeker of lords. I am Ludleth of Corland. Look not in bewilderment as I say. I linked the fire long ago, becoming the Lord of Cinder. If substantiation be thy want, set thine eyes upon my charred corpse. This sad cadaver, no need to be coy. Have a closer look. Knowest thou of our purpose? 5 thrones will take 5 lords as kindling for the linking of the fire. The fast-fading flame must be licked to preserve this world. A reenactment of the first linking of the fire. So it is, I became a Lord of Cinder. I may be but small, but I will die a Colossus.
People point to that line at the end, the I will die like as a Colossus.
Treat the firekeeper not with discourtesy. She is much like thee, prisoners both, kept to link the fire.
As a very important part of the character, and I tend to agree. I'm not going to go into speculation about that right now. We need to see more of the other games in order to really have a good basis on how to speculate for that. But he is apparently, ostensibly, allied with you in this Grand Linking of the Fire. And the part that really stands out to me more so than the Colossus is the use of reenactment. There is a source of, I'm drawing from a book that talks a lot about how myth in the ancient times and times prior to modern society, agricultural society, often used myth. They would have festivals to reenact the creation of their world, and he seems to evoke that, which further evidence in support of that being an inspiration. The book in particular is The Sacred and the Profane. The reason I initially stumbled upon it was the use of the word profane. There are sometimes words that are used in this series that stand out as being unusual. And typically when that's the case, I think there's a mystery into why they were picked instead of more traditional fantasy language.
Welcome to the bonfire, unkindled one. I am a firekeeper. I tend to the flame, and tend to thee. The lords have left their thrones, and must be delivered to them. To this end I am at thy side. Very well. Then touch take nourishment.
Alright, so we're going to do the what is a typical start for me. We will be getting a weapon that doesn't have any kind of scaling, so boosting scaling at the beginning is not that important. And we're not going to be using a ton of magic, so boosting our magic stats is not important. Getting our vigor up to 8 with the initial soul set 18 gives us a bit of more of a buffer room to work with, and I think it's something that I would generally recommend, especially for newer players to the series. Of all of these starting stats in Dark Souls 3, it is the one that is certainly the most user-friendly. The early game doesn't have a lot of scaling opportunities, and you're just not going to get much of a boost from the rest of the stats early on, but having, that extra 260 HP plus whatever the Ember boosts it to, if that's how it works, I can't honestly remember, but it's a buffer zone that will help you survive. I think what's also something that people forget about in these games is that leveling up gives you so many points of passive defense, and that honestly is sometimes more noteworthy
May the flames guide thee.
more noteworthy than more noteworthy than like the damage boosts, especially at earlier levels. We have the start of her journey, the start of her tale. I, in my mind, see the fire in one of the many metaphors that are used for it as the power of storytelling, and by putting our coiled sword in there to ignite it, we begin our story.
Ashen One, produce the coiled sword at the bonfire.
Yes, we did that.
The mark of ash will guide thee to the land of the lords, to Lothric, where the homes of the lords converge. Ashen One, to be unkindled is to be a vessel for souls. Sovereignless souls will become thy strength. I will show thee how. Ashen One, bring me souls plucked from their vessels. Farewell, Ashen One. May the flames guide thee.
I think that will end this episode. It'll probably be a little shorter than typical, but the next segment doesn't really have a good break point in my mind, and I don't want to drag things on too long. Although, who knows, watches end up being like 40 minutes, and I have lost track of time. That's entirely plausible too. We will come back to do, I believe, all of Lothric. I think I can nail that in one sitting. And then after that, we get to my true favorite game in the series, Bloodborne, to be the start of Yharnam. So be sure to check back in for more insane Souls lore.